Elizabeth Carter pressed the folded note against her chest so hard the paper crinkled. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of something alive and real growing inside her. She had planned every word she would say to Nathaniel. She had imagined his face softening for the first time in months. Then, she heard his voice through the door, low, careful, and cold as January stone, and every word she had practiced turned to ash in her throat. If you've ever been doubted by someone who should have believed you, first stay with this story. Subscribe to our channel, follow every part until the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 came to Virginia the way it always did, heavy and relentless, pressing down on the fields like a hand that refused to lift. The air above the Whitmore estate smelled of cut grass and distant rain that never quite arrived. Cicadas screamed in the oak trees along the front drive. The roses along the garden wall had gone past their bloom and were starting to brown at the edges, petals dropping one by one onto the red Virginia dirt below. Elizabeth Carter. Whitmore stood at the window of the upstairs sitting room and watched one of those petals fall. She had been standing there for some time, long enough that the morning light had shifted from pale gold to something harder and more direct. Long enough that her tea had gone cold on the small table beside the chair she had not sat in. Long enough that she had read Dr. Samuel Reed's note 4 times, folded it, unfolded it, and read it again. 6 weeks. Confirmed. You are in excellent health, Mrs. Whitmore. My congratulations. 6 weeks. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. There was nothing to feel, yet no movement, no weight, nothing that betrayed the secret her body was keeping. But she knew. She had known before Dr. Reed put his careful words to paper. She had known the way a woman knows things that no one has told her yet, in the quiet space behind her ribs, where certainty lives before it has a name. She had been afraid to hope for this. After 14 months of marriage to Nathaniel Whitmore, hope had become something Elizabeth handled carefully, the way you handle old glass, aware that it might shatter, aware that the shards would cut, unwilling to put it down entirely, because it was still the most beautiful thing in the room. Their marriage had not been what she imagined when she was a girl. She had imagined warmth. She had imagined a man who reached for her hand without thinking about it, the way breathing happens without effort. She had imagined evenings by the fire and mornings that began with a voice she recognized as home. Nathaniel Whitmore was not that man. He was not cruel. He was not cold in the way some men were cold, deliberate, dismissive, designed to wound. He was cold the way a house is cold when no one has lived in it for a long time. The hearths were there. The structure was sound. But something had gone out in him years before she arrived, and no amount of her presence had managed to relight it. She had tried to understand him. She had tried to be patient. She had told herself that soldiers carried things home from war that their wives could not see, and could not touch, and could not cure by simply loving harder. Nathaniel had come back from the War of 1812, with both his arms and both his legs, and all the outward appearances of a man who had survived intact. But he startled at sounds no one else heard. He woke in the dark hours before dawn, and did not come back to bed. He stood at windows the way she was standing now, watching things that were not visible in the glass. She had learned not to ask what he saw. She had learned a great many things about what not to ask. But this was different. This was something that could not be held quietly forever. This was something that would make itself known to the world, whether she found the right words or not. And Elizabeth, despite everything, despite the careful distance Nathaniel kept, and the silences she had learned to navigate around, felt something crack open in her chest that she recognized as joy. She was going to tell him today. She set the note from Dr. Reed on the table beside her cold tea. She smoothed the front of her dress, pale blue cotton, the color of the summer sky, before it went white with heat. She touched the small blue ribbon she had tucked into her pocket that morning, almost without thinking, a ribbon she had found at the dry goods store in town and purchased for reasons she hadn't fully admitted to herself until now. She would put it on the cradle. The cradle that sat in the locked room at the end of the East Hall, the room she had asked about once in the first weeks of their marriage, and been met with a silence so complete it felt like a door swinging shut. She would ask Nathaniel to unlock that room. She would show him the ribbon. She would tell him about the note. She allowed herself for exactly the length of time it took to walk from the sitting room to the top of the stairs to imagine his face. Nathaniel's face was not an easy thing to read. He kept it controlled the way he kept everything disciplined, contained the expression of a man who had decided long ago that showing what he felt was a form of weakness he could not afford. But she had seen it slip once or twice. She had seen something move through his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She had seen him watch her across the dining room table, with an expression she had almost convinced herself was tenderness. She wanted to see that again. She wanted to give him something that would make him look at her that way on purpose openly, without the careful blankness sliding back into place before she could be certain of what she'd seen. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard his voice. The door to Nathaniel's study was not fully closed. In the heavy summer heat, nothing in the house closed properly. The wood swelled and the latches didn't catch, and sound traveled in ways it didn't in cooler months. She could hear him clearly, even from the landing, even through the half-inch gap where the door hadn't quite pulled shut. He was talking to someone. His voice was low and deliberate, the voice he used when he was being careful, not the clipped sharpness he used when he was angry, not the flat distance he used in polite company, but something in between. Something measured. "I need you to be direct with me, Harlan," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth stopped on the stairs. She recognized the other name. Harlan Moore was Nathaniel's lawyer. A thin, precise man with a habit of pressing his lips together before he spoke, as though he were tasting the words for accuracy before releasing them. "I'm always direct with you," Harlan said. "That's why you pay me. Then tell me plainly." A pause. The sound of something, a glass, perhaps, set down on the desk. "If Elizabeth is carrying a child, and I am not yet saying she is what is the legal position of a man in my circumstance, if the paternity of that child were brought into question—" The stair beneath Elizabeth's foot did not creak. She was grateful for that in a distant mechanical way, the way you are grateful for small mercies when your world has just stopped turning. "Nathaniel," Harlan's voice was cautious, "that is a very significant question." "I'm aware of what it is. Impatient. Brief. Answer it." The legal position would depend entirely on what you were willing to assert, and what evidence existed to support it. In Virginia, a child born within a marriage is presumed to be the husband's. To challenge that presumption, a man would need to demonstrate, "I know what the law presumes." Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. "I am asking what happens when a man has reason to doubt." "What reason?" Harlan asked, and his tone had changed. No longer cautious. Now careful in a different way. Professional. Assessing. "Letters," Nathaniel said. "Correspondence suggesting a prior friendship with a young man, a musician, someone connected to the Ashford social circle. You've seen these letters. I've been made aware of their existence." "By whom?" A pause long enough that Elizabeth's fingers found the banister and gripped it. "That is not relevant to the legal question," Nathaniel said. "It is very relevant," Harlan said. "The source of allegations matters as much as the allegations themselves. If someone with a vested interest in your situation, the letters exist. That is what I know. Have you spoken to Elizabeth?" The silence that followed was the longest one yet. "No," Nathaniel said finally. Elizabeth released the banister. She did it slowly, deliberately. The way you set something down when you understand that it no longer belongs to you, when the act of holding it has become its own kind of injury. She stood very still on the stair. Her hand was against her stomach again. She didn't remember putting it there. The baby she had carried alone for 6 weeks, the secret she had turned over in her hands like something precious. The news she had walked down these stairs to share with a man she had spent 14 months trying to reach. All of it had just been made into something else. Something to be investigated. Something to be questioned. Something that needed legal counsel before it needed a mother's voice. She had not told him yet. He was already doubting her. She heard Harlan say something further, something about evidence and procedure and the complexity of such matters, and she stopped hearing the individual words because the sound of them blurred together into a single note, low and sustained and final, like the closing chord of something she hadn't realized was ending. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the small blue ribbon. She stood there with it for a moment on the landing, with the summer heat pressing down through the windows, and the cicadas screaming outside, and the sound of her husband discussing her honor with his lawyer behind a door that was not quite closed. Then she put the ribbon back in her pocket. She turned around. She went back up the stairs. She did not go to her room. Her room felt like a trap walls. She knew a bed she shared with a man whose voice she had just heard arranging legal strategy around a child he did not yet know. Existed a mirror she did not want to look into right now because she was not certain what her face was doing, and she needed to not know that for a little while longer. She went instead to the door at the end of the east hall. The locked door. She had asked Nathaniel about it once in the early weeks of their marriage, when she was still learning the geography of the house and still believed that marriage meant being permitted to understand the terrain you were expected to inhabit. He had told her it was a storage room. He had said it in the voice that meant the conversation was finished before it had properly begun. She had not asked again. She stood in front of it now and pressed her palm flat against the wood. Behind it she knew was the cradle. She had glimpsed it once through the keyhole ivory-painted wood curved rockers, the kind of thing built with the intention of being used, and then left unused for reasons that lived in the territory Nathaniel did not permit conversation about. She had not told him she'd looked. There were things you learned not to say in a marriage that was held together more by structure than by warmth, more by mutual commitment to the appearance of peace than by the actual achievement of it. She pressed her forehead against the door. The wood was warm from the summer heat. "I was going to put a ribbon on your cradle," she said very quietly to the room she could not enter. "Blue ribbon. I bought it this morning. I was going to show it to your father and watch his face change." She stopped. She stepped back from the door. She was not going to stand in a hallway talking to a locked room and a child who did not yet know it existed in a world that was already building a case against it. That was not who she was. That had never been who she was. She was Elizabeth Carter. She had been Elizabeth Carter for 24 years, before she became Elizabeth Whitmore, and Elizabeth Carter had never in her life stood in a hallway waiting for someone else to decide what her life meant. She straightened her spine. She walked back down the stairs. She waited for him in the dining room. She did not pace. She did not rehearse speeches. She sat at the table with her hands folded, and she waited, because some confrontations need to be met. Sitting down, not because you are weak, but because calmness is its own kind of power. And she had decided somewhere between the locked door and the top of the stairs that she was not going to give Nathaniel Whitmore the version of this conversation that fell apart. He came in from the study approximately 20 minutes later. She heard the study door close properly. This time, Harlan Moore must have pulled it behind him on his way out. She heard Nathaniel's footsteps in the hall. Measured. Even. The footsteps of a man who moved through his own house with the precision of someone who had trained himself not to need to look at where he was going. He stopped when he saw her. Something crossed his face. She had become an expert at reading the fragments of expression he allowed through, and this one was not guilt exactly, not quite. Something adjacent to it. Awareness, maybe. The recognition of a man who knows that a conversation he has been not having has perhaps arrived ahead of schedule. "Elizabeth," he said. "Nathaniel," she said. He came to the table. He did not sit. He stood across from her with his hands at his sides, tall, and controlled the sunlight from the window behind him, making it difficult to see his face clearly. Whether he had arranged that on purpose, she could not say. "You're up early," he said. "I've been up for some time," she said. "I had an appointment this morning." A flicker of something. "I wasn't aware of an appointment. I saw Dr. Reed." She watched his face. He said nothing for a moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly the way it did when he was ordering himself to remain controlled. "Are you unwell?" "No," she said. "I am not unwell." He waited. She looked at him across the table. This man she had married in good faith, this man whose hands she knew, and whose silence she knew, and whose wounded history she had spent 14 months trying to be patient with, and she said, "I went to see Dr. Reed because I needed to confirm something. He has confirmed it. Nathaniel, I am 6 weeks pregnant." She watched it move through him. Whatever he had expected her to say, it had not been this. The control slipped for just a moment. His eyes widened. His breath changed and something complicated and fast moved across his face before the blankness came back down like a curtain. 6 weeks, he said. Yes. He was silent. She had imagined this silence in the version where he was stunned with joy. In that version, the silence was the breath before the embrace, the pause before the softening, the moment between the word and the answer when something good is about to happen. This silence was not that. This silence had edges. Nathaniel, she said carefully. Say something. He turned away from her, went to the window, stood looking out at the drive in the same way she had stood looking at the garden earlier, watching something that wasn't in the glass. I need time, he said, to think. Time to think, she repeated. Yes. About what exactly? He did not answer. She stood up from the table. She was proud of how steady her legs were. She was proud of a great many things about herself in that moment that she would catalog later when she had privacy, because right now she needed all of them. Nathaniel. Her voice did not shake. Look at me. He turned. His face was closed, locked the way the room at the end of the hall was locked. Something in there that he was not prepared to let out, that he was not prepared to let her see, that he had decided required his management before her access. I heard you, she said, this morning. You and Harlan Moore. She watched him understand what she meant. Elizabeth, I heard what you asked him. She kept her voice level. Even. She was not going to give him fury. She was not going to give him tears. She had decided that on the stairs, and she held to it now. Before you knew this child existed, you were already asking your lawyer what your legal options were if you had reason to doubt whose child it was. I was asking a hypothetical. You mentioned letters, she said. Letters suggesting a friendship with a musician, a man named Thomas Bell. She watched his face. I have never exchanged a private letter with Thomas Bell. I have met him twice at social engagements, both times in rooms full of other people, both times briefly. If there are letters, Nathaniel, they are not from me. I didn't say they were from you. You didn't have to. She held his gaze. The question answers itself. You were in your study, talking to your lawyer, asking him what the legal position was for a man who doubted the paternity of his wife's child. And I am the only wife you have. He was silent. She waited. He said, You don't understand the position I'm in. Then explain it to me. There are people in this county who... He stopped. Started again. My family has enemies, Elizabeth. People who would use any opportunity to damage this estate, to damage what I have built here. If there is any question, any suggestion, any whisper, then you ask your wife, she said quietly. Not your lawyer. You ask your wife. He looked at her. She thought for just a moment that she saw him, the real him, beneath the control and the distance and the old damage she had never quite been permitted to understand. She thought she saw something in his face that was not doubt, but something closer to anguish. The look of a man who knows he is standing at a fork in the road and can see clearly which path leads where, but cannot quite make himself choose. Then a knock at the front door broke the moment. Nathaniel looked away. The moment closed. She left the dining room before he could say another word. Margaret Collins had been with the Whitmore household for 11 years. She had come to Whitmore Estate as a young woman and had never left, and in that time she had developed the particular expertise of all long-tenured household staff, the ability to know what was happening in every room of a house without appearing to be paying attention to any of them. She found Elizabeth in the garden 20 minutes after Elizabeth had left the dining room. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, falling into step beside Elizabeth without being asked, because she understood better than most people the difference between company that intrudes and company that steadies. Margaret, Elizabeth said. They walked for a moment in silence. The garden was at its most demanding in this heat, everything leaning toward the sun and the water and needing more of both than the summer was inclined to give. I heard Dr. Reed was here this morning, Margaret said. He was. Good news, I hope. Elizabeth stopped walking. She stood among the roses that were past their bloom among the petals on the ground, and she said, I'm pregnant, Margaret. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, my dear." Not congratulations, not the bright social response. Just, "Oh, my dear." Which was exactly the right thing Elizabeth thought, because Margaret had been in this house long enough to understand that news that should be simple was rarely simple here. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't," Margaret started. "He knows." Elizabeth resumed walking. "He's known for approximately 20 minutes, and in that time he has not said a single word that resembled the word congratulations." Margaret kept pace beside her. "He's a complicated man." "He is." Elizabeth stopped again. "Margaret, who is Caroline Ashford?" She felt the pause before Margaret answered. Just a fraction of a second, a held breath, a small hesitation. The kind that tells you the person has information they are deciding whether to release. "She's the daughter of James Ashford," Margaret said. "Old Ashford family used to have considerable holdings in the next county. The holdings are not so considerable anymore. Debts mostly. Some bad investments about 5 years back." She paused again. "She's been in Virginia society most of the winter. Came back from a few years in Richmond. And her connection to Nathaniel. Their families knew each other years ago." Margaret's voice was careful. "Before your marriage, Miss Caroline and Mr. Nathaniel were considered, that is, there was some expectation in certain circles that they might—" "They were expected to marry," Elizabeth said. "It was spoken of," Margaret said. "By others. I couldn't say what either of them thought of it." Elizabeth absorbed this. She thought about the letters Nathaniel had mentioned. She thought about the name he had given Thomas Bell, a musician connected to the Ashford social circle. She thought about the careful, specific nature of that detail. Not just a vague rumor. A name, a social connection, a thread that led somewhere. "Thomas Bell," she said aloud. "I beg your pardon? Thomas Bell, the young musician. Do you know him?" Another pause. Longer this time. "He works here," Margaret said. "In the garden. He's been here about 3 months." Elizabeth stopped walking. She turned to look at Margaret. "He works in this garden," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And he's connected to the Ashford family. His father used to work for them, I believe. Miss Caroline helped him find the position here." Margaret's voice had gone very flat. The kind of flat that means someone is choosing words with extraordinary care. "I didn't think much of it at the time." Elizabeth looked out across the garden. Somewhere out there, presumably, a young man named Thomas Bell was tending to the grounds of the house, whose mistress's reputation he had somehow been enlisted in destroying, whether he knew it or not. "Where is he now?" she asked. "In the east field this time of morning." Elizabeth turned and walked in the direction of the east field. Margaret fell into step beside her without a word. Thomas Bell was 19 years old and looked younger. A slight dark-haired young man with the kind of face that had not yet decided what it was going to be, still caught between the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. He was kneeling in the dirt of the east field when Elizabeth arrived, his hat on the ground beside him, his shirt darkened with sweat from the morning heat. He looked up when he heard footsteps and came immediately to his feet when he saw who was approaching. He grabbed his hat. He held it in front of him with both hands. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Ma'am." He looked nervous. He looked, she thought, the way a person looks when they have been waiting for something to arrive and are not certain they are glad it has. "Thomas," she said. She kept her voice easy. Conversational. She had learned from watching Nathaniel that a question asked softly is often answered more honestly than one asked sharp. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move. His fingers worked the brim of his hat. "I'd like to ask you something, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer." She waited. He nodded. "Are you acquainted with Miss Caroline Ashford?" The color that moved through his face told her everything before his mouth opened. "I know of her," he said. "My father worked for her family, ma'am." "Have you had any contact with Miss Ashford recently, since taking this position?" His jaw worked. His hands gripped the hat. "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble." "Thomas," she said, "I'm not here to make trouble for you. I'm here because I believe someone may have put you in a position you didn't choose." She watched him carefully. "Am I wrong?" He looked at her. Then he looked at Margaret, who stood a few steps back with her arms folded and her expression the calm, steady one of a woman who has seen enough of the world's arrangements to be very hard to surprise. Then he looked back at Elizabeth. "I didn't write any letters," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "I want you to know that, ma'am. I didn't write them. I wouldn't." "I know," Elizabeth said. He stopped. "I know you didn't write them," she said. "Can you tell me what you do know?" What Thomas Bell knew, it turned out, was quite a lot. He told her, standing in the east field with his hat in his hands, and the summer bearing down on all three of them, that Miss Caroline Ashford had sent word to him approximately 6 weeks ago, around the same time Elizabeth noted privately that a certain doctor's visit had confirmed a certain significant fact. Caroline had reminded Thomas that his father still owed a significant debt to the Ashford family, a debt that had been quietly held, rather than collected, for several years. She had suggested that Thomas might find this debt a great burden to carry for the rest of his life, or he might find that burdens sometimes disappeared when the right kind of assistance was offered. The assistance she required was simple: his name and a vague confirmation if anyone were to ask that he and Mrs. Whitmore had exchanged correspondence. "She didn't ask me to produce letters," Thomas said. "Just to confirm they existed if I was asked. She said nobody would actually ask me. She said just having the possibility was enough to—" He stopped, swallowed. "I didn't know what she was going to do with it. I swear, ma'am, I didn't know what she—" "Did you confirm it?" Elizabeth asked. "To anyone?" He was quiet for too long. "To whom?" she asked. "A man came to see me," Thomas said. "About a week ago. I didn't know who he was. He asked me directly if I had written letters to Mrs. Whitmore. I said I'd rather not say." He looked at the ground. "I know that wasn't right. I know saying nothing isn't the same as saying no. But Miss Ashford said there'd be trouble with my father's debt if I—" "Thomas," Elizabeth said, "look at me." He looked up. "You are not in trouble," she said. "But I need you to understand that what you've described is a serious matter, and the person who put you in that position has done you a disservice along with doing one to me. Whatever debt your father owes, that is not your fault, and it is not your responsibility to pay it with your honor." She held his gaze. "Do you understand me?" He nodded. His eyes were bright at the edges. "I need you to be willing to say to the right people what you've told me today. Not to confirm the lie, to deny it. To say who asked you and what you were asked to do." She paused. "Can you do that?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am. I reckon I can." She did not go back to the house immediately. She walked instead to the far edge of the east field where a row of old oak trees marked the boundary of the estate property. The shade was different here, denser, older, the kind of shade that had been cooling this patch of ground for 50 years or more. She stopped under the largest of the oaks and stood with her back against the bark and let herself breathe. 6 weeks. She was 6 weeks pregnant. There was a child in her that Nathaniel had already decided to doubt before it had a heartbeat he knew about. There was a woman in this county who had manufactured evidence with such precision and care that it had reached Nathaniel's ears and made it as far as his lawyer's office without Elizabeth hearing a word of it until this morning, and only then by accident, because a door hadn't closed properly in the summer heat. She reached into her pocket and took out the blue ribbon. She held it in the light that came through the oak leaves, dappled and shifting. She was not afraid. She identified this with some surprise because she had expected to be. She had expected the moment of full understanding, the moment when the shape of what was being done to her became completely clear to produce fear. Instead, it produced something cooler and more useful. Clarity, maybe. The particular kind of resolve that comes when you understand that the situation is exactly as serious as you feared and that you are still standing. She put the ribbon back in her pocket. She pushed off from the tree. She had work to do. She came back to the house to find Nathaniel in the entrance hall, putting on his riding coat with the quick, contained movements of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before he can think better of it. He looked up when she came in. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, Elizabeth with the dirt of the east field on the hem of her dress and the oak shade still in her eyes, Nathaniel with one arm through his coat and his face doing the thing it did when it was suppressing something it would rather not name. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I have business in town." He finished putting on the coat. "I'll be back this afternoon." "Is your business with Harlan Moore?" He stopped. "Because if it is," she said, "you may want to hold off on any legal proceedings until you've heard what I discovered this morning." He turned to face her fully. His expression had gone very still. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, "that the letters you were told about do not exist. That they were invented by someone who had a specific reason to put doubt between you and me. That the young man whose name was used to give those letters credibility was coerced with a debt he did not create, and that he is prepared to say so to anyone who asks." Nathaniel was very quiet. "The source of the information you brought to Harlan Moore," Elizabeth said carefully. "Was it Caroline Ashford?" She watched his face. She had her answer before he opened his mouth. "Elizabeth, did she come to you directly, or did she find a way to ensure you heard it from someone else?" She kept her voice level, informational, as though she were asking about the price of grain in the county market. "Because the method matters. The method tells us how much planning went into it." "You don't know what you're talking about," Nathaniel said, but his voice had lost something. Some of its certainty. "I know more than you think," she said. "And I know you've spent the last several hours investigating whether your wife betrayed you when the question you should have been asking is who benefits from you believing she did." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it the careful, deliberate way he processed things, the soldier's habit of assessing terrain before advancing. She watched him look at her. Really look perhaps for the first time in months without the wall of careful management in the way. "Why would Caroline Ashford want to—" he started. "Your estate," she said simply. "Your inheritance. If you have no legitimate heir, and your marriage is in question, and your family's standing in this county is damaged, who benefits? Who has a family that is running out of options, and would benefit from your family running out of them too?" She watched him understand it. The understanding moved through him like something slow and heavy. Not an explosion, but a settling the way ground settles after something has shifted underneath it. He stopped. "She's been careful," Elizabeth said. "She didn't accuse me directly. She planted a name and let suspicion do the rest, and it worked." She held his gaze. "You didn't ask me, Nathaniel. Of all the things you could have done, you didn't ask me." He looked at her. She thought again that she could see him, the real him, in the fraction of a second before the control reassembled itself. Something that looked like recognition. Something that looked like a man seeing clearly for just a moment what he had done and what it had cost. "I was afraid," he said. It came out low, almost inaudible. "I know," she said. "My family, the scandal with the inheritance years ago, it nearly destroyed us. I spent years rebuilding what that cost us. When I heard there might be letters, you acted from fear," she said. "Yes, I understand that." She paused. "But Nathaniel, I have been in this marriage for 14 months. I have been patient. I have been faithful. I have tried to understand a man who rarely makes himself available to be understood." Her voice for the first time carried something other than steadiness. Not anger. Something more quiet than anger and harder to dismiss. "And when the most important thing in our lives arrived this morning, the response I received was my husband asking his lawyer whether there was a legal way to question my child's paternity. The silence was absolute. "I am not asking for an apology," she said. "Not yet. What I am asking is this: before you take any action, before you talk to any more lawyers, before you make any more decisions about this family, without telling me what you're deciding, ask me." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I should have asked you first. It was not everything." She was clear-eyed enough to know that it was not everything, that this moment in the entrance hall with the summer heat pressing through the open door was not the resolution, but only the first crack in a wall that would take a great deal more than one admission to bring down. But it was something. It was the first completely honest thing he had said to her in 14 months. She nodded once. She was not going to make more of it than it was. She was not going to soften with gratitude at a man doing the bare minimum of what a husband should do. But she allowed herself to register it, to hold it the way she had held the ribbon, as evidence that something real might still be retrievable. "Come home early," she said. "There are things we need to discuss. About Caroline Ashford, and about Thomas Bell, and about what happens next." She walked past him toward the stairs. She heard him say her name. She paused on the first step. "I'm sorry," he said. It was very quiet. It was imperfect. It was, she suspected, one of the most difficult things he had ever said. She did not turn around. "Come home early," she said again. She went upstairs. Behind her, she heard him stand for a long moment in the entrance hall. Then she heard the front door open and close, and the sound of his boots on the drive going toward the stables. She went to the end of the east hall. She stood in front of the locked door. She pressed her palm against the wood, and this time she made no speech to it. She simply stood there, her hand against the warmth of it, her other hand against her stomach, and she let herself feel all of it for exactly 1 minute. The grief and the anger and the fear. She had not allowed herself in the dining room, or in the garden, or in the east field the full weight of a morning that had given her the best news of her life and the worst in the space of a single hour. 1 minute. Then she straightened. She was Elizabeth Carter. She was 24 years old. She was carrying a child that was hers, whatever anyone said about it, and she had work to do. She went to find Margaret. By evening, 3 things had happened. First, Margaret, at Elizabeth's request, had quietly gathered every piece of correspondence that had passed through the estate in the past 2 months and brought it to Elizabeth's sitting room. Second, Dr. Samuel Reed had been sent for, not for medical purposes this time, but because Elizabeth had remembered something he said at the end of their appointment, something she had not focused on at the time because the primary news had taken everything else. He had said, almost as an aside while she was putting on her gloves, "There's something I've been meaning to speak to Mr. Whitmore about when the time is right. A medical matter from some years back that I believe he may not be fully aware of. It relates to some old questions about the family." She had not asked him what he meant. She was asking him now. He arrived at the estate just before supper, carrying his bag out of habit, and Elizabeth received him in the sitting room with Margaret standing by the door. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His eyes moved quickly around the room, the organized piles of correspondence on the side table, the notable absence of Nathaniel Margaret's particular stillness by the door. He was a perceptive man. He understood he had arrived at something significant. "Is everything all right?" "Please sit down, Dr. Reed," she said. "There is something I need to ask you about, and I need you to speak to me as plainly as you spoke to me this morning." He sat. He folded his hands. He said, "I'll do my best, ma'am." "When I left your office this morning," she said, "you mentioned a medical matter, something related to the family, something you'd been meaning to speak to Nathaniel about." She held his gaze. "What is it?" Dr. Reed was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said finally, "what I'm about to tell you is something I should perhaps have addressed sooner. But medical information is private, and I was uncertain of the right moment, and I confess I hadn't anticipated that the situation would become—" He stopped, straightened. "I'll speak plainly. Some years ago, Nathaniel Whitmore suffered an injury during the war. The details of that injury were managed privately. He didn't want it known. But the injury was such that there was initially some question among the physicians who attended him about whether he would ever father children." Elizabeth was very still. "That question," Dr. Reed said carefully, "has clearly been answered. You are 6 weeks pregnant, and Mr. Whitmore is, by any medical assessment, I'm able to make fully capable of fathering a child. The initial concerns were conservative, precautionary, and they proved unfounded." He paused. "But someone who knew about those initial concerns, someone who had access to the original assessment and not to the subsequent clarification, could use it," Elizabeth said. "Could suggest—" Dr. Reed said carefully that Mr. Whitmore's capacity to father a child had always been in question, making any pregnancy appear more suspicious than it ought. Elizabeth thought about Caroline Ashford's father's family. She thought about old social connections and old family knowledge, and the particular kind of information that passes between households of similar standing over decades. The information that is never written down but is always known. If the original medical assessment still existed in writing somewhere, she said, and the subsequent clarification did not, it would present a very incomplete picture, Dr. Reed said. Is there a subsequent clarification in writing? He reached into his bag. He removed a folded document. He set it on the table between them. I wrote this 3 years ago, he said, when I was satisfied that the initial concerns were unfounded. I've been carrying it because I intended to give it to Nathaniel directly, and the right moment never seemed to arrive. He looked at her. I believe the right moment has arrived. Elizabeth picked up the document. She read it carefully. It was precise, clinical, and completely clear. It established in the unambiguous language of medical documentation that Nathaniel Whitmore's earlier injury had not affected his ability to father children. It was dated, signed, and witnessed. It was also, she realized, the last piece of something she had been assembling all day without fully knowing she was assembling it. She looked up at Dr. Reed. Thank you, she said, for coming this evening and for carrying this. She held the document. I want to ask you one more thing. Of course. If I needed you to present this document to present it formally, before other people at the right moment, would you be willing to do so? He looked at her for a long time. He was a careful man. He understood what he was being asked. He understood that this was not simply a question about a medical document, that it was a question about whether he was prepared to step into something larger and messier and more public than a doctor's sitting room conversation. Yes, he said. I reckon I would, Mrs. Whitmore. She nodded. The third thing that happened by evening was this: Nathaniel came home early. He came home at 4 o'clock, 2 hours before supper, which in 14 months of marriage was something he had never done. He came in through the front door and found Elizabeth in the sitting room with Dr. Reed and Margaret and a table covered in organized correspondence, and he stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not guilt, not defensiveness, not the carefully managed blankness, something that looked almost like respect. I spoke with Harlan again, he said. I told him to hold everything. Elizabeth looked at him. Come in, she said. There is a great deal you need to hear. He came into the room. He sat down. For the first time in their marriage, Nathaniel Whitmore was listening before he had decided what to think. Elizabeth began to speak. Nathaniel sat in that sitting room for 2 hours. He sat with his hat on his knee and his hands folded and his face doing the work of a man who is being rebuilt from the inside while the outside tries to hold its shape. Elizabeth spoke. Dr. Reed spoke. Margaret spoke once briefly in the way Margaret always spoke, precisely without embellishment, with the authority of a woman who had watched this household long enough to know where every wound lived. Nathaniel did not interrupt. That alone told Elizabeth something. In 14 months, he had interrupted her regularly, not rudely, not dismissively, but with the efficiency of a man who believed he could process information faster by redirecting it. He asked clarifying questions before he had heard enough to know what needed clarifying. He moved toward conclusions the way he moved through rooms directly without pausing to see what he might be walking past. Tonight, he sat still. He listened. And when Dr. Reed placed the medical document on the table between them, Nathaniel picked it up the way a man picks something up when he already suspects it is going to change something he cannot change back. He read it. He set it down. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "She knew about the injury." "It appears so," Elizabeth said. "My family kept that private. There were only a handful of people who—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. Her father, James Ashford, was present when the first assessment was made. He was visiting Richmond at the time. He knew the physicians. He pushed back from the table slightly, not standing, just creating distance from the thing he had just understood. He knew about the initial concern. He would have known about it for years. And if Caroline inherited his knowledge without inheriting the correction, she would have had a weapon she could use at any time, Elizabeth said. She waited, Nathaniel said. She waited until there was something to undermine. His eyes moved to Elizabeth's stomach. It was an involuntary look, not controlled, not managed. Just the look of a man understanding in real time the full geometry of what had been done to him and to the woman sitting across from him, and to a child that was 6 weeks old and had already been made into a battlefield. Elizabeth watched him have that realization. She did not make it easier for him. She did not reach across the table. She did not offer the softening word that would have let him absorb it more gently. Some things need to land with their full weight, or they don't teach what they're supposed to teach. Caroline came to me 3 weeks ago, Nathaniel said. He was looking at the table now. She called it a social visit. She'd been in Virginia all winter. I knew that I'd seen her at 2 or 3 gatherings. She was pleasant. She asked about the estate, about the summer plans, about Elizabeth's. He stopped. About you. She asked about you. I thought it was social. Women asking about women. He said it without contempt, but with the recognition of a man who understands he used an assumption as an excuse not to look more closely. She mentioned Thomas Bell. She said she'd heard something concerning. She said she felt it was her duty as an old family friend to make sure I was aware of certain possibilities. Possibilities, Elizabeth repeated. She never made an accusation, he said. She was very careful about that. Every sentence she said could be repeated in polite company and sound like concern. His voice had gone flat. Not cold exactly, emptied. She said she hoped she was wrong. She said she'd hate for there to be any shadow over such a happy household. She said the letters were probably nothing. He looked up at Elizabeth. She said the letters were probably nothing, which meant I would spend the next 3 weeks being unable to think about anything but the letters. Yes, Elizabeth said. That was the point. He absorbed that. Margaret from the doorway said, she did the same thing to the Harrington family 4 years ago, when old Mr. Harrington was deciding who inherited the eastern property. She planted a question about the eldest son. Just a question. By the time it was resolved, the property had been divided in a way that benefited the Ashford family's neighbor, who owed Caroline's father considerably. She paused. I remember it because Mrs. Harrington was a friend of mine. She never understood how it happened. Nathaniel looked at Margaret. Why didn't you tell me this when Caroline Ashford arrived in Virginia? He asked. Margaret looked back at him with the steady, unimpressed gaze of a woman who has served a household faithfully for 11 years and knows exactly where the line between her role and her employer's choices lives. You didn't ask me, Mr. Whitmore, she said. And in my experience, men in your position don't generally ask their housekeepers for assessments of their social callers. There was a silence. Then, extraordinarily, Nathaniel said, That's fair. Elizabeth almost looked away. She had never heard him say those 2 words in that order before, and the unexpectedness of it was almost more difficult to sit with than his silence had been. It was the sound of a man conceding something real, not performing contrition, not managing his image, actually conceding. Dr. Reed gathered his bag and stood. I'll leave the document with you, he said. And I meant what I told Mrs. Whitmore. If there's a formal occasion where it needs to be presented, I'll be there to present it. He looked at Nathaniel. I should have brought it to you sooner, Nathaniel. That's my failing, and I own it. Nathaniel shook his hand. When Dr. Reed had gone, and Margaret had followed him out with the particular tactfulness she deployed when a room needed to belong to 2 people, Nathaniel and Elizabeth were alone for the first time since the dining room that morning. The room felt different than it had that morning. Not warmer exactly, not resolved, but different in the way that spaces change when something true has been said in them. I owe you more than an apology, Nathaniel said. You owe me a great deal, Elizabeth agreed. But right now I need to know something more pressing than what you owe me. She looked at him steadily. Who else did Caroline speak to, besides you? The answer to that question took the next 3 days to fully understand, and the understanding was not comfortable. Caroline Ashford had not limited herself to one conversation with one person. She was, as Elizabeth had already recognized, a methodical woman. She did not throw accusations. She distributed seeds. She had spent the better part of 3 months in Virginia planting them in the most fertile soil she could find, the drawing rooms and dinner tables and church steps where Virginia society formed its opinions, and then treated those opinions as though they had arrived fully formed from heaven, rather than from the careful mouth of a woman with an agenda. Elizabeth learned this the hard way, in the way that women in her position generally learn things that are happening at their expense, not through direct information, but through the accumulation of small signals that each seem minor until you've gathered enough of them to see the shape. It started at the Colby household. Mrs. Colby had been among Elizabeth's more reliable acquaintances in the county. Not a close friend, but the kind of steady social connection that a woman in a new household builds carefully and depends on more than she sometimes admits. She had called on Elizabeth regularly in the first year of the marriage. The calls had become less frequent over the winter. Elizabeth had attributed it to the cold, to the distance, to the ordinary rhythms of social life. She stopped attributing it to those things when she attended the summer gathering at the Whitmore's closest neighbors, the Prescott family, 4 days after the conversation in the sitting room. Mrs. Colby was there. She greeted Elizabeth warmly enough, correctly, properly, with all the social grace that Virginia women of a certain standing deployed, like a language that said exactly what it meant to say, while saying nothing at all. But she did not seek Elizabeth out. She did not sit near her. And when Elizabeth crossed the room toward her, at one point, she saw Mrs. Colby lean toward the woman beside her and say something low, and the woman beside her glanced at Elizabeth with an expression Elizabeth recognized. It was the expression of someone who has been told something they're not sure they believe, but are not sure they disbelieve either. Elizabeth smiled at them both and continued across the room. Her hands were perfectly still at her sides. Inside, something had gone very cold. She found Nathaniel near the window. He came to social events, the way he did most things, with disciplined compliance and minimum personal engagement, and she put her hand on his arm lightly, the social gesture of a wife locating her husband in a room. She said very quietly, and very pleasantly for all the world, as though she were commenting on the weather, "Mrs. Colby has heard something." Nathaniel glanced toward Mrs. Colby. His expression didn't change. "How do you know?" "Because she looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide if what you've been told about them is true." Elizabeth kept her voice even. "She's heard something, and she hasn't decided yet whether to believe it." "That can be managed," Nathaniel said. "It can," Elizabeth said. "But first I need to know how many others have heard the same thing." She squeezed his arm once lightly. "So, smile at me, Nathaniel. Because half the room is watching to see what kind of marriage we have, and the other half has already made up their mind." He looked at her. Then, for the first time, in as long as she could remember, Nathaniel Whitmore smiled at his wife in a room full of other people. It was not a large smile. It was controlled and brief, the way everything about him was controlled and brief. But it was real. She could tell the difference after 14 months between his managed expressions and his real ones, and this was real. She turned back to the room. It was a small victory. She was clear-eyed enough not to mistake it for more than that. But you don't rebuild a house in a day. You clear the ground first. Caroline Ashford arrived at the Prescott gathering approximately 40 minutes after Elizabeth and Nathaniel. Elizabeth heard the change in the room before she saw the cause of it, a small shift in energy, the way a room adjusts when someone enters it, who alters the social temperature. She turned, and there was Caroline Ashford, standing in the doorway of the Prescott parlor. She was a handsome woman. Elizabeth had known this from the 2 previous occasions she'd encountered her, but she felt it more sharply now with the full knowledge of what this woman had done and was continuing to do. Handsome in the way that certain women are handsome, who have learned very early that their appearance is a tool, and have kept it well maintained. She wore pale green, and her dark hair was dressed simply, and she moved into the room with the ease of someone who has never in her life doubted that she belongs in any room she enters. Her eyes found Elizabeth's almost immediately. The look that passed between them lasted only a second. It contained no malice. Caroline Ashford's face showed nothing that could be named, nothing that could be reported, nothing that a woman relaying the story later could describe as anything other than a pleasant social acknowledgement between 2 acquaintances. She inclined her head very slightly. She moved into the room. Elizabeth tracked her progress without appearing to. She watched Caroline take a cup of tea from the offered tray. She watched her greet Mrs. Prescott. She watched her move through the room the way a skilled gardener moves through a garden, attending to each thing briefly, efficiently, in a way that looks casual but isn't. She watched her sit down with Mrs. Colby. Margaret was not of the gathering. It was not the kind of event household staff attended, but Margaret had been doing her own quiet work in the days since the sitting room meeting, and she had told Elizabeth something that morning that Elizabeth had been turning over ever since. Miss Ashford has been visiting the lending library in town every Tuesday, Margaret had said. Mr. Bell's mother runs it. She's been friendly with Mrs. Bell, very interested in Thomas, very concerned about how he's settling in at the estate. A mother's concern, socially unimpeachable. And also, Elizabeth understood clearly a line of communication back to Thomas Bell that didn't require Caroline to speak to him directly. She was managing her liability. Elizabeth set down her teacup. She made a decision. She crossed the room to where Caroline Ashford sat with Mrs. Colby, and she sat down in the empty chair beside them, and she said pleasantly with the full warmth of a woman who has nothing to hide, and knows it. "Caroline, I'm so glad you're here. I've been hoping for the chance to speak with you." The look on Caroline Ashford's face lasted only an instant, something between calculation and surprise gone before most people would have caught it. "Elizabeth," she said, "how lovely." Mrs. Colby excused herself with the instincts of a woman who can identify an interesting conversation and has decided she'd rather not be directly inside it. Elizabeth and Caroline were effectively alone. "You've been in Virginia all winter," Elizabeth said. "It must be wonderful to be home." "It is," Caroline said. "I do love the summer here." "And your family? Your father as well?" "Quite well, thank you. Brief. Controlled. Watching. I'm glad to hear it." Elizabeth smiled. She let the smile sit for a moment. Then she said, still pleasantly still, in the same register of social warmth, "I had an interesting conversation with Thomas Bell this week." Caroline's expression did not change. She was good. She was very good. But Elizabeth had spent the last 4 days becoming a student of Caroline Ashford's techniques, and what she was looking for was not on the surface. It was in the hands, the very slight adjustment of fingers around the teacup. "Oh," Caroline said. "Yes, he's a talented gardener. We got to talking about his family, his background, his connection to yours." Elizabeth kept her eyes on Caroline's face, kept her voice warm and conversational and completely without accusation, because she had learned from watching Caroline that the most effective thing you can say is the thing that sounds like nothing. "He spoke very highly of your family's kindness to his father. It's a generous thing to carry a debt quietly for so many years rather than collecting it." The teacup was very still in Caroline's hands. "I didn't realize you knew Thomas," Caroline said. "He works in my garden," Elizabeth said. "I know everyone who works on my property." A pause. "Well," Caroline said, "he's a good boy." "He is," Elizabeth agreed. "Very honest. I find that quality remarkable in young people. The willingness to tell the truth, even when they're afraid of the consequences." She stood. She smoothed her dress. She smiled at Caroline Ashford with every social grace she had ever been taught, and she said, "I hope you'll call on us at the estate sometime this summer, Caroline. I'd like that very much." She walked away. She did not look back. Behind her she heard nothing. No cup set down. No movement. Just the sound of the room continuing around the space where Caroline Ashford sat very still recalculating. Hunt. Nathaniel found her on the drive outside 20 minutes later. She had needed air, and she had needed to be away from the room where Caroline Ashford was sitting and recalculating, and she had needed a moment where no one was watching her face. He came to stand beside her. He didn't ask what had happened. He stood with her the way he'd almost never stood with her before, just present without managing the moment, without directing it toward some more useful outcome. After a while he said, "She didn't look rattled." "She isn't rattled," Elizabeth said. "Not yet. She's recalculating." She watched the drive. "She'll move faster now. She knows I've spoken to Thomas, and she'll want to contain that before it becomes a formal problem." "How do you know that?" "Because it's what I would do," Elizabeth said, "if I were her." He was quiet for a moment. "You are nothing like her." "No," she agreed. "But I understand how she thinks. She's not stupid, Nathaniel. She's been planning this for months. She won't abandon it because I sat down next to her at a party. She'll adapt." "Then we need to move before she adapts." "We do." Elizabeth turned to look at him. "Which means you need to decide something." "What's that?" "Whether you're willing to make this public. Not just to correct a legal concern, not just quietly, but publicly. Whether you're willing to stand in front of the people who have heard these whispers and say plainly what was done and who did it." He was quiet. "Because a quiet resolution," she said, "protects everyone, including her, and it leaves the whispers in place, even if the legal question is removed. People will still have heard what they heard. They will still have formed what they've formed." She held his gaze. "A public resolution puts everything in the light. It protects us, and it protects Thomas, and it holds Caroline accountable. But it is not comfortable. It will be a scene. It will be spoken about. It will require you to stand up in front of your county and say that you made a mistake." Nathaniel looked at her. She could see him working through it, the private man who had spent his life controlling information about himself, the soldier who protected his positions, the husband who had managed even his own household at arm's length. She could see how much it cost him to even consider what she was describing. "If I do that," he said slowly, "and I'm wrong about any piece of it." "You're not wrong about any piece of it," she said. "We have Thomas's testimony. We have Dr. Reed's document. We have the pattern of behavior with the Harrington family. We have the timeline of Caroline's visit to you and her subsequent social activity." She paused. "What we don't have is the original letters she claimed existed. But the absence of letters is itself information if it's presented correctly." He absorbed all of this. "Who would we present it to?" he asked. "The county magistrate's summer gathering," she said. "In 3 weeks. Almost everyone who has heard the whispers will be there. It's the appropriate occasion to address a matter of social and legal consequence. It's public enough to carry weight and structured enough to be orderly." "You've already thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about little else," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The sun was going down behind the Prescott house, turning the sky the particular deep gold of Virginia summer evenings, and Nathaniel Whitmore stood in the light of it, looking at his wife as though he was seeing her for the first time, which was perhaps not entirely inaccurate. "Elizabeth," he said. "Yes, I know that." He stopped, started differently. "I'm aware that what I did going to Harlan before speaking to you was not only wrong, it was a specific kind of wrong, the kind that tells a person what you think of them without saying it in words." He looked down at his hands for a moment. He was not a man who looked at his hands. The gesture was unfamiliar on him. "I've spent years being afraid of the wrong things, afraid of scandal, afraid of what this county thought, afraid of the same thing happening to this family that happened before." He looked up. "I was so afraid of being deceived that I made myself into the kind of man who could do something very close to what I was afraid of being done to." She was quiet. "I don't know how to—" He stopped again. "I'm not good at this." "I know," she said. "I'm trying to learn it." She turned to face the drive again. The evening was coming in quickly, the way it did in summer, the light going gold, and then amber, and then blue, without much warning. She could hear the sound of the party behind them, the conversations and the music that had started up the evening portion of a gathering that didn't know it had contained a critical exchange. 3 weeks, she said. "We have 3 weeks before the magistrate's gathering. I need you to trust me for those 3 weeks. Not to make any legal moves without telling me. Not to speak to Caroline Ashford or any of her people without discussing it with me first. Not to make any decisions about this family's public position alone." He said, "You're asking me to let you lead this." "I'm asking us to lead it together," she said, "which is different from what you're used to. I know that." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to become a different man in 3 weeks, Nathaniel. I'm asking you to make room for me to stand next to you instead of behind you." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might retreat into himself the way he retreated from things that required more vulnerability than his training had prepared him for. Then he said, "All right." 2 words. She held them carefully. "All right," he said again, and this time it sounded less like an agreement, and more like something being set down and taken up again differently, the way you put a tool down and pick it up with a better grip. They went back inside together. What happened in the next 2 weeks came at them from every direction at once. which was Elizabeth understood exactly as Caroline Ashford had planned it. The first thing was Mrs. Colby. She came to call 3 days after the Prescott gathering, which was either brave or calculating depending on how charitable you chose to be. She arrived at Whitmore Estate in the middle of the afternoon and asked for Elizabeth, and Elizabeth received her in the parlor with Margaret present and tea. She hadn't requested already on the table because Margaret had anticipated this call and prepared for it accordingly. Mrs. Colby sat down. She arranged herself. She looked at Elizabeth with the expression of a woman who has rehearsed a conversation and is now discovering that the performance is harder than the rehearsal. "I owe you a direct word," she said finally. "I appreciate that," Elizabeth said. "I have heard things, over the winter and the spring. Things that I want to tell you, I did not give a great deal of weight to, but which I cannot say I gave no weight to either." She looked at her hands. "I should have come to you sooner. I'm not sure why I didn't. Perhaps because it was easier to wait and see." She looked up. "I don't think it was a credit to me." Elizabeth looked at her steadily. "What did you hear?" The specifics were useful. Mrs. Colby, to her credit, gave them the version of the story that had been circulating in her social circle, which was more specific than Elizabeth had hoped, and less damaging than she had feared. Caroline had planted the question of paternity carefully, but she had been more restrained in the wider social sphere than with Nathaniel directly. The version circulating in drawing rooms was vaguer, not an accusation, but an uncertainty, the kind of thing that makes people wonder without giving them anything concrete to repeat. It was designed to create a climate, not a conviction. Smart, Elizabeth thought. Leave the specifics for the person who would act on them. Leave the vagueness for everyone else. That way the damage spreads, without the source being traceable. "Who told you?" Elizabeth asked. "It came to me through—" Mrs. Colby paused. "It came to me in a way that I now understand was not accidental. Someone wanted me to hear it. I think I understood that at the time, and chose not to examine the understanding too closely." She straightened. "I'm not proud of that. I don't think you're a bad person, Mrs. Colby," Elizabeth said. "I think someone used your existing uncertainty about me, the natural uncertainty of a woman meeting a new neighbor, a new member of her social circle, and turned it into something more significant than it would otherwise have been. That is a specific skill. It requires knowing your audience." Mrs. Colby absorbed this. "Will you be able to address it?" she asked. "Whatever has been said." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "In 3 weeks, at the magistrate's summer gathering." "I'll be there," Mrs. Colby said. She said it simply without drama. It was an offer of presence, which was what Elizabeth needed, not a declaration of loyalty, just a body in the room. "Thank you," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Colby left. Margaret brought fresh tea. Elizabeth sat with it and thought about the magistrate's gathering and what needed to be in place before then. The second thing was Thomas Bell. He came to find her not the other way around this time on a Wednesday morning when the heat had become something almost solid, the kind of air that presses against your skin and makes you feel like you're moving through something heavier than atmosphere. He found her in the garden, which was where she spent a portion of each morning now, partly because the roses needed attention, and partly because the garden had become the place where she thought most clearly, where the physical work of her hands seemed to settle the more complicated work of her mind. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hat in his hands, and the look he always had. The look of a young man who is trying to decide if he's in trouble and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, ma'am, there's something I need to tell you." She looked up from the rose she was examining. "Tell me." "Miss Ashford's man came to see me, yesterday." Elizabeth straightened slowly. "What man?" "I don't know his name. He said he worked for her family. He came to my rooms in the evening, said he had a message for Miss Ashford." Thomas's fingers worked the brim of his hat. "He said Miss Ashford wanted me to know that the debt situation, my father's debt, was being reviewed. That it might be called in sooner than expected. That—" He stopped. "He said it real friendly, ma'am, like it was good news, like he was just passing along information. But it wasn't friendly. I could hear what he was saying under what he was saying." "She's reminding you of your vulnerability," Elizabeth said. "Yes, ma'am." "She's worried," Elizabeth said. "She knows I've spoken to you, and she doesn't know what you told me." She's trying to reinforce the pressure before you can do anything with the information." She looked at him carefully. "Thomas, has she communicated directly with you at any point? Letters, messages, anything in writing?" He thought about it. "One note. When she first approached me, asking me to call on her at the house she was staying at. I still have it." Elizabeth's attention sharpened, the way it sharpens when something expected and useful arrives. "May I see it?" "Yes, ma'am." He reached into his jacket. He had brought it. He had come prepared, which told her that Thomas Bell, underneath his youth and his nervousness, had a quality she valued more than either of those things: common sense. She took the note. She read it. It was careful as Caroline Ashford was always careful. But it was in her handwriting on her paper, requesting a private meeting with a young man who worked on the property of the woman she was attempting to ruin. That was not nothing. "Thomas," she said, "in 3 weeks at the magistrate's summer gathering I am going to address this matter publicly. When I do, I'm going to need you there." "Yes, ma'am," he said. He did not hesitate. She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket alongside the medical document she had taken to carrying with her, now the way you carry things you cannot afford to lose. "The debt your father owes," she said. "When I have addressed this matter publicly, and when it is resolved, I will speak to Nathaniel about it. The Ashford family will have considerably less leverage over your father's situation once their conduct in this affair is public knowledge." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do that, ma'am," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "But you stood in front of me in this garden 2 weeks ago and told me the truth when you were frightened. That's worth something." She turned back to the roses. "Now go back to work. I need these beds looked after, and I need the man looking after them to still be employed here in 3 weeks." He put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon so." He went back to work. The third thing came at night. It was after midnight, the house settled and dark, when Elizabeth woke suddenly from a sleep she hadn't been aware of achieving. She lay in the darkness for a moment, uncertain what had woken her, listening to the sound of the house, the summer sounds, the insects, the occasional settling of old wood. Then she heard it. Movement in the hall. Quiet. Careful. The particular quality of footsteps that are trying not to be footsteps. She sat up. She knew this sound. She had heard it enough times in 14 months to recognize it: Nathaniel, in the hours before dawn, moving through the house to wherever he went, when the nights became too much for him. She had never followed him. She had never asked. She had drawn the boundary of his private pain, and respected it the way you respect a boundary you haven't been invited past. She got up. She followed him. He was in the room at the end of the east hall. The door was open. Not just unlocked open. Standing open in the dark of the hall, with pale moonlight coming through the window inside, and Nathaniel standing in the middle of the room with his hand on the cradle, not rocking it, just resting his hand on it, the way she had rested her hand on the door weeks ago in a different version of the same gesture. She stood in the doorway. He heard her. He didn't turn. He stayed very still with his hand on the cradle. "I used to lock this room," he said, "because it felt like a claim on something I wasn't certain I had the right to claim." She waited. "My first marriage," he said. It was the first time he had ever said those words to her directly. "I've never spoken to you about it." "No," she said. "She died. Before there was no child. There might have been one early in the marriage. There wasn't. She died in the winter of 1813. I was still away at the time." He paused. "I built this room for her, for the child we were going to have. When she died, I locked it." Elizabeth crossed the threshold into the room. She did it quietly. She stood beside him at the cradle. "I don't know how to want things," he said. "I learned to stop wanting them. It seemed like a practical solution to the problem of losing them." "That's a very lonely way to live," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They stood together in the room he had kept locked for 4 years, and the moonlight moved across the cradle between them, and Elizabeth felt something shift in the space between them that she had no word for. Not forgiveness, not resolution, not the neat closing of a wound, but something more honest than any of those things. The shift of two people finally in the same room in every sense that mattered. "The blue ribbon," she said. He looked at her. She reached into her pocket. She had been carrying it so long she had stopped thinking about it, the way you stop thinking about the weight of things you've carried too long. She held it out. He took it. He stood for a moment, looking at it in his hand. Then he tied it carefully around one of the curved spokes of the cradle. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. It was the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes. In 3 weeks, I'm going to stand in front of everyone who has heard Caroline Ashford's whispers, and I'm going to make sure they understand what was done here." She looked at him. "When I do that, I need you beside me. Not behind me and not in front of me. Beside me." He looked at the ribbon on the cradle. Then he looked at her. "I'll be there," he said. It was not a large promise. In the balance of everything that had been broken and needed rebuilding, it was a small promise. But Elizabeth had learned that small promises kept are worth more than large ones made and managed from a careful distance. She nodded. She left him in the room with the cradle and the ribbon and the particular silence of a man who is finally letting himself want something again. She went back to bed. 3 weeks. She closed her eyes. There was still a great deal of work to do. The morning of the magistrate's summer gathering arrived the way important mornings always arrive, unremarkably without fanfare, with the same light and the same heat and the same sound of the house waking up that any other morning carried. Elizabeth was already awake when the light changed. She had been awake for an hour, lying still in the dark, with her hand against her stomach, and her mind running through everything that needed to hold together today for the plan to work. 3 weeks of preparation came down to this. She got up. She dressed without calling for assistance. She had chosen her dress the night before. Deep green cotton. Nothing ornate, nothing that announced itself. She wanted to look like a woman who had nothing to prove, because a woman who has nothing to prove doesn't dress like she's going to war. She dressed like she was going to a gathering. The fact that she was in every way that mattered going to war was information she intended to keep to herself until the moment it became unavoidable. Nathaniel was already downstairs. She heard him in the dining room before she reached the bottom of the stairs. The sound of a cup set down the particular quality of a man sitting alone with something on his mind. She went in. He looked up. He was in his good coat already. He had shaved closely. He looked like himself, controlled, self-contained, all the machinery running smoothly beneath the composed surface, but his eyes, when they met hers, were not managed. They were just there. Just his. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. "You, not much." He stood and poured her tea without being asked, which was something he had never done in 14 months of marriage, and which he did now with the careful naturalness of a man practicing a thing he intends to make habitual. "Margaret has already gone to the Prescott house to help with the arrangements. She'll make sure we have what we need." Elizabeth took the tea. "Thomas. He'll be there by mid-morning. I had Harlan confirm his presence is requested and that he's protected from any—" He paused. "From any pressure that might be applied before he can speak." "Good." She sat. She drank the tea. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the quiet between them was different from the quiet that had lived in this house for the better part of a year. That quiet had been the quiet of two people carefully not saying things. This was the quiet of two people who had said enough that silence could simply be silence. Then Nathaniel said, "Elizabeth, whatever happens today, I want you to know that I am not going there to manage the outcome. I'm going there to stand beside you." She looked at him across the table. "I know," she said. She finished her tea. They left for the gathering together side by side, which was also something that had not been their habit, and which she noted without comment, filing it alongside the tea and the open door at the end of the East Hall, as evidence of a man working very hard to become something better than he had been. The Prescott Summer Gathering was the largest social occasion in that part of Virginia between the spring planting and the fall harvest, and it drew every family of standing within 20 miles. By the time Elizabeth and Nathaniel arrived, the grounds were already populated with the full weight of county society, the men grouped near the outer edges conducting the business of the county under the cover of social conversation, the women arranged in the interior in the complex social architecture that governed everything important in a community while appearing to govern nothing at all. Elizabeth felt them register her arrival, not dramatically, not with obvious reaction, but in the way of small communities that have been fed a question about someone, a slight adjustment of conversations, a recalibration of attention. She had expected it. She walked through it the way she had walked through the entrance hall the morning she overheard Nathaniel's conversation with Harlan Moore, with her spine straight and her hands steady and absolutely no indication visible to anyone watching that she felt anything except at ease. Nathaniel stayed beside her. She found Margaret near the east side of the grounds, standing in the careful position of a woman who has arranged herself to be easily located by the right people and easily overlooked by everyone else. "It's set," Elizabeth said low. "Dr. Reed is with Magistrate Fowler. Thomas is by the carriage house. Harlan Moore has the documents." Margaret's eyes moved briefly to the left. "Miss Ashford arrived approximately 20 minutes ago. She's been in conversation with Mrs. Harrington." Elizabeth absorbed that last piece. Mrs. Harrington, whose family had been damaged by Caroline 4 years ago, according to Margaret's own account. Either Caroline didn't know that Margaret had told Elizabeth about the Harrington matter, or she was bold enough not to care. "Which Mrs. Harrington?" Elizabeth asked. "The daughter-in-law, young Mrs. Harrington. She's been in Virginia 3 months, she wouldn't know the history." Elizabeth nodded. "All right," she said. "When Magistrate Fowler opens the formal portion of the gathering, we move. Not before." "Understood," Margaret said. Nathaniel, who had heard all of this, said nothing. He stood beside Elizabeth with his hands clasped behind him, and the particular stillness of a man who has surrendered control of a situation to someone more prepared to handle it and is maintaining that surrender through an act of will. She appreciated that more than she could easily say. The first sign that the day would not proceed according to plan arrived 30 minutes later in the form of a man Elizabeth had never seen before. He was speaking with Harlan Moore near the edge of the grounds, a thick-set man in a coat that had seen better seasons, with the manner of someone who had arrived at this gathering with a specific purpose and was executing it without any interest in the social occasion around him. She noticed him because of the way Harlan's posture changed when talking to him, a very slight stiffening the body's honest response when it encounters something it wasn't expecting. She excused herself from the conversation she was maintaining with Mrs. Colby, crossed the grounds without hurrying, and arrived at Harlan's side just as the thick-set man was producing a folded document from his coat. "Mrs. Whitmore," Harlan said. His voice was careful, the careful that meant he was deciding how to say something difficult. "What is this?" she asked, looking at the document. Harlan took it. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it again, which was the legal equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. He handed it to Elizabeth. It was a sworn statement. It was signed by a woman Elizabeth didn't recognize, a name she had never heard from a county 3 counties over. The statement described in formal legal language a correspondence between Elizabeth Carter and a man named Thomas Bell, beginning in the spring of 1815, when Elizabeth would have been 22 years old. The statement included specific details, dates, locations, descriptions of the content of the letters. It was precise in the way that fabrications made by careful people are precise, because vague lies invite scrutiny, and specific ones create the illusion of memory. Elizabeth read it to the end. She handed it back to Harlan. She looked at the thick-set man. "Who gave you this?" "I'm a courier, ma'am. I was engaged to deliver it to Mr. Moore." "By whom?" "A law office in Richmond. He named it." She didn't recognize it. "When were you engaged?" "Yesterday morning, ma'am. Yesterday morning. The day before the gathering. Not 3 weeks ago, when this whole affair had been set in motion yesterday." Which meant Caroline had been holding this in reserve. She had not deployed it at the beginning. She had waited to see what Elizabeth would build, and then, when she understood the shape of what was coming, she had produced this, a witness, an independent witness from another county. Someone Elizabeth had never met, someone with no visible connection to Caroline Ashford, someone who could not be explained away by pointing to a debt or a threatened inheritance. Elizabeth's mind moved very quickly through the implications. She said to Harlan very quietly, "Do not enter this into any formal record yet. Not until I've had 10 minutes." Harlan, who understood the law well enough to know that 10 minutes could mean the difference between a situation that could be managed and one that could not, said 10 minutes. Elizabeth walked toward the carriage house. Thomas Bell was where Margaret had said he would be, near the carriage house wall out of the main site of the grounds. He had dressed carefully for the occasion, his best coat, his hat held properly, the earnest formality of a young man who understood that today was important and wanted to look like he understood it. She reached him and said without preamble, "There's a sworn statement. A woman from another county claiming to have witnessed correspondence between you and me." He stared at her. "There's no, I know," she said. "Think carefully. A woman 3 counties over. Someone who would know details of your life from 1815. Who would have that?" He was already shaking his head, and then he stopped shaking it. His face changed. "Thomas," she said. "Who?" He swallowed. "My aunt, my father's sister. She lives in that county. She and my father, they haven't spoken in years. There was a disagreement over the estate when my grandfather died. She blamed my father." He looked at Elizabeth with the expression of a man understanding something terrible. "She'd say anything about my father. Anything that hurt him would please her. And if Miss Ashford found her and told her that this would hurt, it wouldn't even need to hurt your father directly," Elizabeth said. "It just needs to hurt you because you're the liability. You're the one who can contradict the story." She thought fast. "Is your aunt the kind of woman who could be persuaded to recant a false statement if she understood the legal consequences of maintaining it?" "She's the kind of woman who doesn't want trouble," Thomas said. "If she knew she was in legal territory, if someone made it clear to her that a false sworn statement is perjury." "Harlan Moore can do that," Elizabeth said. "Not in a threatening way, in a factual way. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "Thomas, in approximately 40 minutes, Magistrate Fowler is going to open the formal portion of this gathering. I need to know something before then. Is there anything at all that you haven't told me? Anything Caroline has done or said that I don't know about?" He held her gaze. He was quiet for exactly long enough that her attention sharpened. "Thomas," she said. "There's a letter," he said. "Not to you, not about you. A letter Miss Ashford sent to my father about 3 months ago before I came to work at the estate. About the debt, about the arrangement." He reached into his coat. He had it with him. He had been carrying it the way she had been carrying Dr. Reed's document. She wrote to him directly. She told him the debt would be forgiven if his son cooperated with certain matters at the Whitmore estate. She was specific about what cooperation meant. Elizabeth took the letter. She read it. It was the most important piece of paper she had held in 3 weeks of collecting important pieces of paper because, unlike everything else, unlike Thomas's testimony, unlike Dr. Reed's document, unlike Caroline's original note requesting a private meeting, this letter was not ambiguous. This letter in Caroline Ashford's own hand described the arrangement. It named Thomas. It named the Whitmore estate. It named the objective. It was not a seed planted in conversation. It was documentation. "Why didn't you give me this when we first spoke?" she asked. Her voice was even. "I was afraid," he said. "If I gave it to you, and it came out where it came from, she'd call in the debt immediately. And I didn't. I wasn't sure yet what you were going to do. I needed to see if you were actually going to fight this, or if you were going to—" He stopped. "Or if I was going to quietly accept the situation," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him. "You were testing me," she said. "I reckon so," he said. He didn't apologize for it, which she appreciated. An honest answer from a young man in an impossible position was worth more than a guilty apology. "All right," she said. She put the letter beside Dr. Reed's document inside her pocket. The pocket was getting full. "Come with me." She found Nathaniel at the edge of the main gathering, which was where he gravitated when left to his own devices at social occasions, the periphery where he could see everything without being required to engage with most of it. He looked at her face when she approached and understood immediately that something had changed. "There's a sworn statement," she said. "A witness from another county." She said it quietly, her back to the crowd, her face arranged in the expression of a woman having a pleasant conversation at a summer gathering. It appeared this morning, delivered to Harlan. Caroline held it in reserve. She felt him absorb this. She felt, without seeing it, the familiar tightening, the movement toward the managed response, the instinct to assess and control. But what he said was, "What do you need?" Not "What does this mean for us?" Not "Can we still proceed?" "What do you need?" She pulled Caroline's letter to Thomas's father from her pocket. She handed it to him. She watched him read it. His face went through something she had not seen before. Not fury-controlled men don't move into fury quickly. Something more deliberate. Something that settled in his jaw and in the set of his shoulders, and in the quality of his stillness, which became the stillness of a man who has just found the thing he needed to find, and is deciding precisely what to do with it. "She put this in writing," he said. "She did," Elizabeth said. "Which tells you something about how certain she was that Thomas Bell would never give it to us." "She miscalculated." "She did." Elizabeth glanced at the gathering. People were beginning to move toward the central area where the formal portion of the event would take place. "Nathaniel, I need 10 more minutes with Harlan before Fowler opens the proceedings. I need you to delay Caroline, not obviously. Just keep her occupied," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Elizabeth, this letter, this is enough." "It's more than enough," she said. "But I want to be certain before we bring it forward. I want Harlan to have looked at it and confirmed that what I'm reading is what it is. I don't want to present this and have Caroline's lawyer argue that it's ambiguous. Harlan won't let that happen." "No," she agreed, "but I want to be certain." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to recognize over the past 3